I threw the final shovel of dirt on top of the grave, patted it all sort of flat, then sat down on the grass nearby and started to sob. Not for the first time that day. The funeral ceremony was long since over. Everyone who wanted threw a handful of dirt on the grave. Some, not many, picked up the shovel, thrust into the dirt pile, and threw a shovelful of the brown dirt onto the white coffin. The coffin she picked out for herself when it became obvious to all that she wasn't getting out of this adventure, as she liked to call them, with only minor scrapes and bruises. This time her punishment was going to fit the crime, she had said. Her crime, she knew, was being too selfish to live life like most other people. She had the gifts of music and beauty, and she used them like weapons of mass destruction to get what she wanted, and to hell with anybody else. She didn't care if you loved her or hated her, as long as she got what she wanted from you. It was better if you hated her, because then she would just use you for a while and toss you away. It was much worse if you loved her, because then she would heap all sorts of abuse and indignities upon you until there was nothing left, finally crushing you under her boot heel like a spent cigarette butt. Of course, then there was me. I loved her and she loved me back, so she kept telling me, and I got the ultimate indignity of being crushed over and over again, like a cat with 9 lives losing one every so often. All because I loved her, and she loved me back. I don't know how long I sat on the grass sobbing, but I eventually noticed several of the cemetery workers approaching to finish up at the gravesite. I picked up my suit coat off the ground, fished my handkerchief out of my breast pocket, and dried my eyes. I folded my coat over my arm, nodded at the worker who appeared to be in charge, slowly walked to my car and drove off. That would be the last time I was sober for a month. Everybody called him Father Ron, but technically he was Reverend Ronald Combs. He appeared one day when I was heading into my local liquor store, a 10-minute walk from my quiet country home. The store opened at 10 a.m., and by 10:05, I usually had made my day's selection of a bottle and was heading home. Not on this day, however. On this day, Father Ron was waiting for me by the door to the liquor store. "I know you know she's not going to show up again no matter how long you stay drunk," he said to me as I reached for the door handle. I jumped back like I'd touched hot metal. I had no idea who the hell this guy was, only that he was dressed like a Catholic priest. And I wasn't a Catholic. At that moment, I couldn't have told anyone what religion I was, and I didn't care. I was one hungover son of a bitch, and I wanted my daily bottle of drunk. I was actually thinking it was going to be a tequila day until that goddamn priest got in my face. Maybe it was the hangover, but to me the priest sort of looked like Gene Hackman from the 1970s movie, The French Connection. That struck me funny, and I chuckled. Okay, I actually coughed and choked a bit. I looked from the priest's face up into the sky and mumbled, "You've got a hell of a sense of humor there, big guy." "You talked to the boss too?" Reverend Hackman lookalike asked. I know I gave him my best fuck you look, but after being drunk for almost a month straight, I probably looked more like a pathetic asshole than a pissed-off drunk. No, former Yankees owner George Steinbrenner's been dead for a long time. I was talking to God, you yuts, I mumbled. That's who I was referring to as well, the priest said in his best friendly tone. Then why were you talking about Steinbrenner? I asked. I was pretty sure he was sober, but he seemed to be making less sense than me. Reverend, one of us needs help, and I'm sorry to say it, but I don't think it's me. You wouldn't happen to have a cup of coffee at your home, would you? He asked. That was an easier question to answer. I was starting to like this guy. Sure do. Why don't we head on over to my place and I'll make you a good cup of coffee. Can't do any of that froofy shit with the creamy stuff and the crazy flavors, but good old black coffee I can do, I said. We walked back to my house. On the way, he told me his name and the name his congregation called him. He told me he was outside the liquor store waiting specifically for me. Was it God or George Steinbrenner who told you about me? I asked. Neither. It was a friend of yours, Steve Rodriguez. He told me you'd had a rough go of it recently and figured I might be able to help. Yeah, Steve's a good guy, I said. I knew he was just trying to help me when I threatened to throw him through my front door recently. You wouldn't hit a man of the cloth, would you? He inquired, not looking too awfully worried. Only if you try to put anything other than milk or cream in your damned coffee, I answered honestly. Fair enough, he said. I'm not sure what Father Ron was expecting when he got to my house. It was a 4-bedroom, 500-square-foot ranch with an attached professional music studio off the back end. Prior to my life coming from a liquor bottle, I was a pretty good music producer by trade, The house was clean because I had a maid come in every day. I think the good father thought I was going to be living in a hovel, at least maybe a pigsty. I made a pot of dark roast for my guest, I'll admit to getting the shakes as I started to sober up. Why don't you sit here and drink some coffee and I'll be right back? You interrupted my booze run, remember? No, why don't you sit your ass back down in that chair and drink some coffee with me? It was a command, not a request. I was confused. Wait a minute, I protested. Priests aren't supposed to curse. That's my job. No, right now your job is to drink some coffee and tell me what's gone wrong, he said. It might be quicker if I tell you what's gone right, I responded. We lived down the block from each other when her family moved into my family's neighborhood when we were both 5 years old. Even at that age, I thought she was adorable. She had what I call long, blondie blonde hair and glowing bright blue eyes. She was just as skinny as I was. At that age, I kept my distance from most girls due to them having cooties. Somehow Kennedy Stevens was different. I wanted to be around her. We held hands almost any time we had to go somewhere, even when my friends made fun of me. She didn't play baseball and I didn't play dolls, but we did virtually everything else together. If I wasn't at her house eating dinner, she was at mine. We were ick and snick. Kennedy gave me my first girl kiss on Valentine's Day when we were 6. She also gave me my first real kiss on my birthday when I was 13. We dated exclusively through most of the first 2 years of high school, until Larry Thomas asked her to junior prom in the spring of that year. I was devastated when she accepted. As a junior, Bobby, you can't even ask me to junior prom because you're only a sophomore, she said with a happy squeal when she told me about Larry asking her. To say I was devastated wouldn't even have come close to how I was feeling at that moment. But I thought you were my girlfriend, I whined. I am, Bobby, but a junior asked me out to the junior prom, she cried. I can still be your girlfriend, but just go on that one date with him. I was hardly a worldly man at 16, but something just didn't feel right about my supposed girlfriend going on a date with another guy, even if it was the junior prom. No, Kennedy, if you go on a date with him, I guess you're his girlfriend, I said, and walked off. Bobby! Kennedy didn't come to my house for dinner, and I didn't go to hers for the next week before my mother said something at the dinner table. Did you and Kennedy have a fight, Robert? She asked stiffly. The formal parent tone in her voice told me she did not approve of whatever I did to cause the rift. My father, older brother, and younger sister stopped eating and looked at me like I had just killed Mother Teresa, a dead man walking. I started to gasp, but then I realized I didn't want to look like a coward in front of my family when the problem was not my fault. I gathered my courage before answering. Not a fight. Kennedy told me she's going to the junior prom with Larry Thomas, I said flatly. So, she's still your girlfriend, isn't she? Mom asked. I lost tons of respect for my mother right then. I mean, I understood she was a parent and had to honor some sort of parent code or something, but she was also a girl and had to know that a girl can't go on a date with a different guy when she's got a boyfriend. Everybody knows that. No, Mom, not anymore. If she wants to go to the junior prom with Larry, then I guess she's his girlfriend. Geez, Mom. Attitude, Bobby, warned my father from his spot at the head of the table. Come on, Mom. Even I know that Bobby just got dumped big time and I'm only in 8th grade, said my sister Susie, who was grinning like the mouse that got the cheese. This isn't any different than when Mrs. Sproat from down the block went out on a date with Mr. Sproat's boss, interjected my brother Arnie. Mr. Sproat divorced her so fast her head is still spinning. Both of my parents blushed at that. I guess they didn't think we kids were old enough to figure out what was happening. My father cleared his throat, which meant whatever he was going to say next was earth-shattering and should be written in stone to be remembered for all time by the whole family. Well, just don't be mean to that girl, Bobby. We still like her, and who knows, maybe you guys will kiss and make up sometime. Yes, sir, I said as respectfully as possible. Eating resumed at that point, and that conversation was over, even though I could tell my mom wasn't ready for it to be finished. Kennedy went to the junior prom with Larry and had a good time, she told everyone. I guess she dated him for a while after. I really didn't pay attention. All of her friends made sure I knew about her relationship. It took several months before we resumed a casual friendship. By junior year, I was actually a football star of sorts and didn't lack for female attention. I was still skinny at 6'2", 150, but I was fairly fast and had the gift of grab. I could catch almost anything thrown my way. I had several college scouts tell me I would have been scholarship material if I were just big enough. While it wasn't good enough for college money, my notoriety, long curly brown hair, and big brown eyes were more than good enough for the girls at my high school. Another thing I had going for me in high school was my musical talent. I was a pretty good guitar player and singer, and was a member of our school's concert choir band all 4 years. The old saying that chicks dig guitars is an old saying for a reason. The choir director actually tried recruiting me for the choir because of my baritone, but I preferred playing guitar to singing and dancing. He wasn't happy with me, but the choir band director was ecstatic. Kennedy made the concert choir our junior year. She loved music and had a decent soprano voice. She was also a pretty good dancer, which combined with her good looks meant she was often up front on most of the routines. She also always had her share of admirers hanging around her, which was fine with me, seeing as we were only friends at best. At least that's what I thought. I had already nailed down my date for the fast-approaching junior prom when Kennedy and her BFF Haley sat down with me at lunch one day. Not exactly something that was a regular habit for either of them. I had to admit that Kennedy was a beautiful girl, and her body had filled out nicely from the days when she was a skinny 5-year-old. Anyway, after giving both she and Haley a perfunctory up and down, I put my burger down and sighed loudly. "What can I do for you fine ladies today?" I inquired in a formal manner. "Well, I know you are aware that junior prom is coming up soon, and you seemed very upset about not going last year," Kennedy started. "So, I'm here to let you know that I'm available to be your date this year." She looked me right in the eyes without flinching. If anything, I thought I saw a hint of a smirk on her face. Haley, on the other hand, looked anything but comfortable. Haley and I hadn't been this close in proximity since I broke up with Kennedy. "What about Larry? Or who's the latest guy, Chad?" I asked confidently. Kennedy flinched visibly. Haley took a huge gulp of air. "I just told you. I'm available now. I'm not dating anyone. I can be your girlfriend and we can go to the junior prom," she said. "Just like that?" I asked. "Just like that," she said. "Well, not quite. Already got a date. Already got a girlfriend," I said. It seems somebody wasn't up to date with my life. Kennedy blanched, then teared up. Haley's mouth dropped open in shock. I resisted the temptation to smile. Okay," Kennedy said quietly before rising from her seat and leaving along with Haley. I gained another 20 pounds during the next year and had another excellent football season, although I still wasn't big enough for a Division I scholarship. I did get a partial ride, though, to a D2 school, and decided to be a music major. Except for a few passing hellos, I hardly talked at all to Kennedy during the next year. A few days before I left for college, though, we wound up at the same goodbye party for the kids going away to school. We nodded at each other, but didn't talk to each other for the first couple of hours. That didn't stop me from kind of keeping track of her throughout the night, and at one point I noticed both she and Haley were MIA. I took a casual look around the house we were at, noticing one of the home's bedroom doors was closed, but there were several voices coming from the room. The smell of weed was also coming from the room. I grabbed a beer and hung out near the closed door room. 20 minutes later, Kennedy and Haley stumbled out of the room, giggling. I walked up to both, put my arms around them, and hustled them off to the backyard, where most of the people were. Since I hadn't been keeping track of Kennedy, I didn't realize she was into marijuana. I rarely did anything of that sort. It just wasn't for me. I was a drinker, though, so I really couldn't put down stoners too much. Anything harder than that, however, like coke, pills, and heroin, was on my no-fly list. I guess the weed turned Kennedy on, because within minutes she was all over me in the backyard, running her hands over my body and trying to check my tonsils with her tongue. At first I thought she was just fooling around and played along in front of our friends, but as things escalated I stopped playing around and got serious, especially when she started rubbing her big tits against my chest. I became very uncomfortable in my jeans and quickly revised my plans to ignore her squirming. I walked my giggling ex-girlfriend to the car where I shoved her into the back seat and got down to some serious action. 45 minutes later, I found out that neither of us were virgins when we began our activities. I have to admit that for a moment I was disappointed that I wasn't the one to take Kennedy's cherry. Once we finished and got redressed, I took Kennedy to a nearby International House of Pancakes. No surprise, she had the munchies. I also wanted to give her time to come down from her high, just in case she encountered her parents when she went home. "Damn, Bobby, how come we haven't ever done this before?" Kennedy giggled. "Why the hell did you ever give up on us in the first place?" It was easier to take knowing she was high as a kite. Otherwise, I would have been tempted to jump a lot harder than I did. I didn't give up on us, Kennedy. You did. You just had to go to the junior prom with Larry, I said quietly. But that didn't have to end us, Bobby. That was your choice. It was just one date, she moaned. Maybe in your world, it didn't have to end us. In my world, we don't have timeouts in our relationships. Ever. You were asking for something I just could not give. She dropped her eyes to the pancakes she was eating. They stayed there for the rest of the meal. When did you start sparking up? That a new thing? I asked as we drove home. Nothing to worry about, she answered. Haley and I just do it from time to time. You're not going to give me the lecture about weed today, heroin tomorrow, are you? Isn't that kind of hypocritical considering you drink? No lecture for me, and for the record, I don't make the connection from pot to heroin. What I do worry about, though, are the people, I said. The band was setting the house on fire on a Friday night in a Nashville, Tennessee hotspot when I spotted her at a table near the front, but off to the side. She was sitting with 3 other friends who all looked to be hot, but it was easy to see she was the hottest. She had on a short jean skirt, tight pink top that clung to her boobs, and her blonde hair was in a high ponytail that came down to mid-back. It took a few minutes, but we finally made eye contact, and I saw the glow in those blue eyes. I was playing to her and she knew it. She got up and walked to the edge of the playing area where she encountered our lead singer, Rick. Like all lead singers, Rick thought the hot girl was up there for him. But when she pointed to me, he moved out of the way and she practically got face to face with me while I was playing. We hit a groove and moved in sync, our eyes locked on each other. I was in the middle of it and I could still tell it was hot. It went on like that for another 2 minutes as we finished the song, me playing and us swaying while Rick, obviously inspired, hit a new level on his vocals. Even with everything going on, I could hear and feel the crowd buzzing. Rick did a big arm circle as the song ended, and once I took my pick away from the strings, Kennedy and I stepped toward each other and kissed, soft and gentle on the lips as the crowd roared. We stood like that, in our own little world, for about 5 seconds, the crowd on its feet clapping and loud, before I finally came to my senses. Hey, I've got to go back to work. Hang around, got a break coming soon, I half whispered. She smiled brightly, nodded, and went back to her table as we lit into another song. Our break came 10 minutes later. I unplugged, turned my gear off, and headed for Kennedy's table. She was standing up, waiting for me, and when I got within a few feet of her, she moved into me and wrapped herself around my body while we kissed like lovers. Really hot lovers. For the second time in a few minutes, we lost ourselves in each other, until one of her friends brought us back to the moment by loudly coughing. We separated about a step and both of us inhaled deeply. Ladies, this is Bobby Winkler, and if you can't tell, he's a very old and very good friend, Kennedy said. We've known each other since we were about 5 years old. A waitress put a cold Corona in my hand and I sat down at the table with Kennedy and her friends. Kennedy held my free hand the entire time. After a few minutes, I had to get back up and play, but Kennedy promised to stick around until we ended our show. All 4 girls stuck around until the end of the show. None of the guys seemed to mind when the girls hung with us as we packed up. We called ourselves Road Noise, and were pretty successful in the Nashville area. Alan Beauchamp and I both worked at a Nashville recording studio, which was my first real job after graduating from college. We would sit around and noodle after the day was done, sometimes joined by other co-workers. Through friends, we found ourselves a bass player, Mike Rogers and Rick Jones, a guy with a pretty good set of pipes. My boss let us use a practice room from time to time, and before we knew it, we were playing some clubs. As our reputation grew, so did the size of the clubs and our paydays. While all 4 women were pretty, I could tell my bandmates were most impressed by Kennedy, which didn't surprise me in the least. It was pretty obvious to everyone, though, that she was most impressed with me, as most of her looks and conversation were directed my way. I hadn't seen Kennedy since just before our freshman years of college when we had sex in my car. We both knew what that night meant, and we hadn't kept in touch at all since then. We were both surprised to find the other in Nashville. It seemed Kennedy's philosophy degree didn't open any doors in any field she found interesting in the year since she graduated. She had just drifted around since graduation before finally landing a job at an art studio in Nashville through her cousin Alexa, who lived here. She had been here for just 2 months. Kennedy and I became an item of sorts. We shared a lot of good history, and she was certainly a beautiful woman. About a month after we got together, we were sleeping together, and a month after that, she had moved into my apartment and bed. Kennedy started coming to our practice sessions, and when the guys found out she was a pretty good singer, they encouraged her to sing backing vocals for us. She got pretty good at that and enjoyed it, and I had no problem with her doing it. In fact, I wrote us a song that had her singing lead, and after smoothing over Rick's hurt feelings, he was okay with taking backup on it. She had great stage presence, too, and I think our audiences really enjoyed it when she moved from the side of the stage to center for her song. I know for a fact that Kennedy really enjoyed the rush she got from performing. I didn't know it at first, but some of Kennedy's rush wasn't just from performing. Somewhere along the line, she developed a taste for cocaine. At one of the parties after a gig, I lost sight of her for a while. Remembering that she would occasionally do some weed as a teen, I figured I should go find her and keep a watchful eye on her. Not being shy, I poked my head into the rooms with the doors closed, usually finding several people inside smoking. I found Kennedy in the fourth room I looked into, where several people were imbibing cocaine from the coffee table. Kennedy's nostrils were ringing from the cocaine and her eyes were burning. She was laughing hysterically at someone else's words. The crotch of her white panties was visible as she sat on the floor. "Time to go," I said to the crowd in general as I walked up behind Kennedy and lifted her to her feet. "No, Bobby, we're just having some fun," she whined as I lifted. She fought me a little as I got her to her feet, but stopped when I tapped on the end of her nose none too gently with my right index finger. I pulled her out of the room by her elbow while she acted like a petulant child. Her high was in full swing by the time we got home. Her mad was gone and she wanted to fuck. I was too weak to resist, and we wound up fucking twice before we both ran out of steam and drifted off to sleep. Kennedy was quiet and recalcitrant when she staggered to the kitchen table the next morning. At least this time, I knew her apparent hangover wasn't from booze. "How long has this been going on?" I asked as I slid a plate of bacon and eggs in front of her sorry-looking face. "A while, maybe a couple of months," she responded in a whisper. "Not liking this at all, babe," I said in a voice that reminded me an awful lot of my dad's. "I'm okay with the weed, but this crosses the line. You know, sooner or later you are going to go too far and somebody's going to take advantage of your high ass." "I know where the line is and I can look out for myself," she snapped defensively. "You don't have to run in and rescue me like a knight in shining armor." Although she tried to hide it, I knew she was doing coke at every party we went to for the next few months. She was too high to know that just because I didn't see her doing it, I could still tell she was high. It became a big turnoff for me, although she always wanted rough physical sex when she was high. I started to turn her down, which resulted in several knockdown drag-out arguments, including one where she finally went too far. She flounced out of the room in our apartment. I heard a car pull up and assumed she took a taxi somewhere. She didn't come back until the next afternoon, looking the worse for wear and wearing clothes that weren't hers. I didn't ask, she volunteered. Stacy gave me some things to wear after I spent the night on her couch. I had spent a sleepless night pacing around the apartment. I tried tender. I tried tough. I knew nothing was going to change until she wanted to make the change. I also knew that I was at my wit's end, and I wasn't going to let her take me down this rabbit hole with her. We didn't go to another party for a month, even though she begged me every weekend after we'd performed. I started seeing the old Kennedy come back, and I was more than a little pleased. We were packing up after another show when the begging started. As I had for the last month, I turned her down flat. This time, things were different. "If you won't go with me, I'll just go with Mike," she said, referring to the band's bass player. "Hell take me, and he won't lecture me like my father. Hell, let me party. Will he take care of you too after I'm gone?" I asked deadpan. The rest of the guys had stopped packing up and were listening and watching us. I shot Mike a death glare, and he decided at that moment to put some more stuff in his trunk. I was well aware that my bandmates would all take a shot at Kennedy if I weren't around, even though they were supposed to be my friends. There is friendship. And there is friendship. Kennedy walked out the door of the club without another word. "I've got my stuff. One of you guys can take the band's things," I said. "We'll watch out for her, Bobby, I promise," Alan said. "Sometimes you just know things. I wish it was different, but it was what it was. I knew, but I had to confirm it. Had to see it with my own 2 eyes. I showed up to the party about 2 hours later. I grabbed a beer and made my way around. No sign of Kennedy, which meant she was in a room with a closed door. This time it was door number 2. I opened it and saw her and Mike in a very compromising position. They were so into it, both making lots of noise, that they never bothered to look my way. For a brief moment, I thought about confronting Mike, But that wouldn't have changed a thing, except it would have made me feel a lot better. She was the one I was really upset with, but I don't believe in hitting women. I closed the door to the room, and just as I turned to go, I looked up and there was Alan standing a few feet away. "Waiting for your turn?" I asked. "Good job of watching out for her, by the way." I downed the rest of my beer, no sense wasting good beer, then made my way to the door and left. Frustration and anger filled my mind. A few hours later, I woke up in my 1985 Ford Mustang at a rest stop about 200 miles west of Nashville. I brought my seat up to a sitting position and cleared my head. I took stock of my 2 guitars and 2 suitcases in the back seat and remembered that the rest of my gear and stuff were in the small trunk. I also remembered the exact reason I was sleeping in my 16-year-old car and not in my bed. Damn it. My boss was not happy when I called in from the road on Monday morning and quit on the spot. I gave him a brief explanation of why, and he wished me luck. Most people of a certain age know Fort Wayne Inn as the home of Major Frank Burns from the long-running television series, MASH. Nowadays, Fort Wayne is also known as the home of Sweetwater Sound Inc., the largest retailer of musical instruments and pro audio equipment in the United States. If you were looking for a good place to do recording engineering and hide in 2001, Fort Wayne was as good a place as any. Sweetwater employed a menagerie of musicians in a variety of jobs, and finding a band needing a guitarist was not hard. I not only missed the performing, but I missed the thrill provided by a receptive audience. It wasn't long before I became a highly sought-after engineer, and the new band I was in, Crushing Grapes, was busy almost every week. Whether it was because of the band, or just because I was a fairly handsome guy with a good personality, I was enjoying a big social life, which translated into a big sex life, too. Perhaps the only thing I really lacked was sleep. It was a good problem to have. The snake slithered into the Garden of Eden a few years later, thanks in part to social media. As I found out later, Haley Kissinger was watching music videos on YouTube when she spotted a familiar face. A second look confirmed that the guitarist playing with some no-name band in Indiana was indeed a former classmate of hers, Bobby Winkler. She squealed with glee, whipped out her cell phone, and called her lifelong friend, Kennedy Stevens, to tell her about the video with Kennedy's former boyfriend of a lifetime ago. I was trying to figure out which musician needed assistance as I headed to the lobby of the Sweetwater recording studios. I looked at the woman standing there once, twice, finally 3 times before I recognized the face of Kennedy Stevens. She was still a pretty woman, but looked about 10 years older than her actual 28. I had to guess that her coke habit was responsible for that. I wondered if she still partook. We looked at each other awkwardly for about a minute while I waited for her to speak. "You look good, Bobby. It's been a minute, hasn't it?" "You lost?" I asked. "What brings you to the end of the earth?" Haley was watching music videos on YouTube, and guess who popped up? You. I did a little research, and here you are. I decided I needed to catch up, she said. "Well, how nice. Great talk. See ya." I turned to walk away. She reached out and grabbed my left arm. "I need to apologize, Bobby. At least let me do that," Kennedy said. "Can we talk?" Shit, I really didn't want to do this, but sometimes being an adult means you have to do things you don't want to do. "I'm working right now, Ken, but if you come back at 5, we can grab dinner and talk. You still like Italian?" She nodded brightly. I felt myself smile. Somewhere in this woman was still the 5-year-old girl I fell in love with many years ago. She was waiting for me in the lobby at 5. I led her out to my Mustang. "I can't believe you've still got this car," she chirped happily. I drove us to Olive Garden. After all, she didn't deserve good Italian. I'm sure she knew exactly what I was thinking when I pulled up in front of the restaurant. We sat quietly for a minute after the waitress took our order. Kennedy was looking down at the table and nervously drumming her fingers. "I've got dinner, but this is your show, Kennedy," I said. She grimaced. I could see the wheels turning in her head. She gulped audibly. "Damn, I've been practicing this for 2 years. You'd think I'd have it down by now. Just where the hell do I start?" she said. "I screwed up big time, Bobby. I got into partying and kind of lost myself. And then I lost you literally. How can I apologize for that? Nothing I've practiced sounds sincere. You can apologize for the partying, Ken, but you can never apologize for cheating on me with Mike. Saying I'm sorry just doesn't cut it." "I didn't do anything with Mike. Who told you that lie?" Kennedy cried. I sat stunned by the blatant lie. She had no clue I was in the room while she was with Mike. "No one told me you were with Mike. I saw it with my own eyes, liar." It was Kennedy's turn to be stunned. She sat slack-jawed, probably wondering how she could have missed me in the room she shared with Mike that night. I went to the party late. I found you and Mike going at it. Need I say more? I asked. She shrieked and buried her head in her hands. I made a mistake. One mistake and you left me? How could you leave me? She choked out between sobs. It was a hell of a mistake, babe. You of all people should know I don't share. Not once, not ever, I said. They say women are the fair sex. That may be, but they certainly don't play fair, especially when it comes to sex. Kennedy was more than contrite, but interestingly enough, she didn't go away. She waited 6 months before showing back up at my place, suitcase in hand. She told me she intended to stay for a few days while she looked around the city. She wanted a new start in a new place, she said. But she liked the fact that she would have me around if she chose Fort Wayne. All right, so I'm weak. I made sure, however, that she understood one thing. No more coke. That was absolutely non-negotiable. Our not being a couple again was also supposed to be absolutely non-negotiable. But only in my mind, I found out. She slowed-walked her way back into my heart, first starting out in my second bedroom for a week, then moving into my bedroom when she decided to move to Fort Wayne permanently. I held out for almost 7 weeks before we had sex for the first time, and it was every bit as good as I remembered. The next year was probably the best of my life. My career was flourishing. Our band was performing all over the Midwest, and I had a beautiful and sexy woman sharing my life. Kennedy didn't know it, but I had actually bought an engagement ring. I still had my problems getting over my trust issues with Kennedy. I supposed I always would. I employed the trust but verify gambit, and she had been completely faithful for 18 months. Maybe I could get over her one mistake after all. The only small bump on the horizon that I was even somewhat concerned with came from the band. I knew our bass player, Jimmy Ralston, had a thing for Kennedy, and when he thought I wasn't paying too much attention, I would notice him trying to chat her up. I warned her gently to stay away from Jimmy as much as she could, and I warned him not so gently that I'd break his bridge hand if he didn't keep a safe distance. Why did it always seem to be the bass players that needed watching? Kennedy and I were driving back in my SUV loaded with band gear after a killer performance the band had at a club in South Bend on a Friday night when cherries popped on from the car behind me. I pulled onto the shoulder and stopped to let what was obviously a cop car go past, but instead of going past, he pulled in behind me. I knew I wasn't speeding, so I looked over at Kennedy and shrugged my shoulders. She gave me the one eyebrow-raised look, and I chuckled to myself, thinking that someday she was going to be using that patented eyebrow raise on our children. I wasn't chuckling when the police officer came up to the window, asked me for my license and registration, and then told me to exit my vehicle. There's no way I was speeding, officer. I was doing 40 in a 45, I whined, starting to get a little annoyed. Kennedy was also told to vacate the vehicle, and the two of us stood with a second officer as the first started to inspect everything. I was more than a little annoyed, but I've always been taught to respect the police, so I refrained from saying anything, at least until the first cop told the second to handcuff me. What the hell is going on? I shouted as the bracelets clicked shut. Cop number 1 lifted a baggie of white powder, which I presumed to be cocaine, from the spare compartment. You could have knocked me over with a feather. I've got to admit that I immediately wondered if it was Kennedy's stash. She must have been reading my mind because she looked at me and quickly shook her head. To make a very long story short, I wound up with a 2-year sentence for a level 4 felony. I was sent to the state correctional facility at Albion, about 45 minutes away from my former home, but a world away from my former life. The whole episode was surreal, and I probably wasn't at my best during my arrest and trial. I couldn't believe I was actually going to prison for drugs that were not mine. Kennedy had her own car, so I put the Mustang into storage along with my guitars and gear and anything I considered important. She had arranged for one of her friends from work to move in with her so she could keep a roof over her head. Our last night together before I went in was as sweet and tender as any time we were together. We made love a little more physically the second time that night. We went back to slow and gentle in the morning before I had to show at Albion. We both cried hard when I left. Kennedy visited me every weekend for the first month, then cut down to every other week for the next 2 months. The next month, she was down to just once, complaining that the drive of 45 minutes was tedious. Really? I said nothing, knowing where this was going. Between work and traveling someplace to watch my former band perform, she was awfully busy. And coming to the prison was always such a downer, she told me. I felt so fucking sorry for her. I told her to save herself the pain of coming down to see me at all, and she felt so relieved she never came back. Thanks to early release for good behavior, thank you, Mom. I only served 18 months of a sentence I did not deserve. I didn't tell anyone I was coming home. I just figured I surprised Kennedy by just showing up at the apartment one day, and we would enjoy one hell of a homecoming. It was. I showed up on a Saturday afternoon around 3 and let myself into the apartment with the key I still had. Metallica was blasting from the stereo, so I figured I could have set off a small bomb and still not have been heard. I didn't find anyone until I got to the bedroom, and then we all got a surprise. Jimmy Ralston, yes, that Jimmy Ralston, was on the bed with Kennedy, and my moaning ex-girlfriend was as big as a house, at least 7 months pregnant. Wow, I shouted, breaking them from their, shall we say, reverie, as they both stopped and turned to me open-mouthed. I looked at the pair, and then realized the absurdity of the situation and burst out laughing. Apparently a lot of action has been going on from what I can see, I yelled in amusement before dissolving into uncontrollable laughter. The fornicating duo ceased their activity and separated, both looking shocked. Bobby, you should have called. I would have. Ha ha ha! What would you have done? Would you have gotten away with it? I warned you about him, I said. Maybe you should have heeded your own warning, shithead, Jimmy chimed in. Once I got you out of the way, she was easy pickings. Easy. We were fucking almost before you got to Albion. Well, it seems my loss is your gain, I said cheerfully. You seem awfully happy for a loser, Jimmy said. I shrugged and walked over to the closet where I had left a few things when I got sent to Albion. I reached into the closet for a pair of gray cowboy boots, then reached down into the toe of the right boot and brought out a ring box. Kennedy's eyes teared up when she saw the diamond engagement ring. Oh God, she whispered absently. I closed the box and stuck it in my pocket. I took the boots too. I walked out to my Mustang, which I had gotten out of storage the day before, and left for my next adventure. I was proud of myself that I was able to wait until I got out of sight of the old apartment before I started to cry like a baby. I tried to make it seem like I no longer cared, but in reality I was devastated. Jimmy had set me up, but he had helped to do it. She had to have given him access to the car. Oh yeah, them shacking up and her getting knocked up made me no difference after Jimmy opened up his big mouth. I got a great reference from Sweetwater, and 2 months later I had a job at Paramount Recording Studio in Los Angeles. I loved my job, and the LA music scene was everything everybody always said it was. A few months after I got settled in, I got hooked up with a blues rock group. 6 months down the road, we were playing all over the state. Although I wasn't in love with anyone, my social life was doing fine. Between my natural charm and being in a band, my sex life was even better. Maybe God figured he owed me one, or I was just in the right place at the right time. I was part of a crew working on a recording for an up-and-coming rock band that had it going on, but on the final song, things just weren't clicking. Group members went back and forth because they felt it really needed that one more song. We were all on the clock making good coin while the band debated what they were going to do. But then I got an idea. With so much time on my hands at Albion, I had started writing songs, something I barely dabbled with before. I filled most of a book with my prison songs and had continued to write after I got out. I kept the book with me at work so I could scribble during dead times. I had the song the band needed, if they would give me the time of day to hear it. Fortunately, the lead guitarist had heard my band and liked us, so he convinced his bandmates to give me a listen. I got my book. He handed me his Les Paul Classic and I played. Heads were nodding. I think if we sped it up a bit and added more texture to the bridge, this would work for you guys, I said. The 5 band members and I threw some ideas back and forth. They worked on it for about 30 minutes, and finally we recorded it. I got my first writing credit, even if I wasn't expecting to see many dollars. I was right about not getting a big payday out of that song, but it wound up being the single that received the most airplay. It was amazing to hear a song I wrote on the radio. So what else you got in that book that we can use? Came the voice on the other end of the phone about 2 months later. John Valentine, the lead guitarist for Chess Piece, and I had a lot in common musically. We went through my book and he picked out a half-dozen songs he thought we could rework for the band. Much to my surprise, he suggested that he and I get together and write another half-dozen. Hell yes, I agreed. It took us 6 months to Frankenstein 6 songs and rework my 6 songs for the band. Naturally, they recorded at Paramount, and in addition to engineering on the creation, I got to help with backing vocals and guitar work. John and I even worked out a hot guitar duet for one of our collaborations. The band went out on a small tour just as the CD was hitting the airwaves, and by the time the tour finished, Chess Piece was a household name on the West Coast. A tour for the rest of the country was quickly set up. Meanwhile, 4 songs from the album received good airplay nationwide. Just like that, I was a hit songwriter as the CD went platinum, selling 1 million copies. I wasn't born yesterday, though, and kept my day job. John and I wrote 9 songs together, and I wrote 3 solo for the next Chess Piece album, for which I also served as producer. The album again went platinum, and one of my solo songs, Reach Higher, was #1 for 2 weeks. The guys invited me to accompany them on their nationwide tour. I accepted and had a blast. I even sat in for backing vocals and guitar on a few of the shows. I never had a clue how tough it was to tour. I took it as the compliment it was meant to be that the guys started calling me the 6th chess piece. The band's record label threw a giant party when the CD hit platinum. As one half of the album's songwriting team, of course, I was invited. Trust me, cocaine is a given at every big party in LA, and this party was no different. I was usually able to figure out where it was at the parties I attended and stayed away from those rooms. Not a big deal. On this night, however, I was passing by one of the Coke motels when a woman staggered out of the room and right into me, spilling my Don Julio tequila down the front of my shirt. I jumped back when we collided. Then I looked into a pair of familiar bright blue eyes set into a much older-looking face than it should have been. "Oh, Bobby," she hesitated. "I'm so sorry. I didn't see you." "Well, there it is. I finally got an apology out of you for something," I snarked. She looked up at me in shock. She stammered, but nothing came out of her mouth. "Hey, sorry I never sent a baby gift. How rude of me," I continued on. Even though she was high as a kite, she still looked struck by my comment. I was confused. "I gave the baby up for adoption after she was born," Kennedy said. "Jimmy didn't want her. Said he enjoyed knocking up your woman but didn't want to raise any kid." I saw the tears in her eyes. At one time, I would have given her a caring hug. Now I couldn't get away from her fast enough. She disgusted me. I shook my head sadly and walked off to find some paper towels to dry my shirt. She sniffled. I couldn't tell if it was because she was tearing up or because of the cocaine she had just snorted. I didn't know if she was still with Jimmy. I wasn't about to ask. I didn't see him, but I assumed he was inside the room doing coke. Because I really enjoyed engineering, I was still working part-time at Paramount. They were glad to have a hit songwriter and producer on staff. I was still writing by myself and with John, and I was producing for 8 bands. I was producing for one of those bands when Jimmy Ralston walked into the studio. He was contracted to play bass. He smirked when he saw me. I glared back at him. Then I crooked a finger at the band's manager. He came onto my side of the glass. "That man needs to leave now," I said to the manager as I pointed to Jimmy. "No, he has to stay. He knows the music. He's been practicing for weeks now," the manager said. "Fine. Then Ill leave and Sandy Levy can produce for you. Hope to work with you sometime in the future," I said as got up from my chair. The group's leader, singer Freeman Hatch, came jogging out to the parking lot just as I was getting into my new Mustang Cobra. "Hey, I don't know what's going on with you and Jimmy R, but we just can't cut him loose. We contracted him for this gig," Freeman said. "I'll reimburse you," I said pointedly. "I won't work with that man. Ever. He'll tell you it's because he stole my girlfriend and knocked her up. But I'll tell you it's because of my vacation in the Indiana State Pen another lifetime ago," I said. My past wasn't a secret, especially my incarceration. "He dropped a dime on you?" Freeman asked. "After he persuaded said girlfriend to give him access to my car," I responded. "I don't do coke, either the cola or the powder." "Okay then, I get it. His history," Freeman said. "Perfect," I said. I guessed Freeman passed the word around about Jimmy because his prospects around LA suddenly evaporated, from what I was told. He was working as a waiter in a pretty nice restaurant and still attending the parties, but nobody was hiring him to play for them, and nobody was picking him up to be in their band. I wasn't sure where Kennedy was working, nor did I care. When I did see her, she was high. Apparently, she had gotten back into coke big time, and from what I could see, it was taking its toll. Despite the fact that she and Jimmy were still together, they had never married. I was also hearing stories that she occasionally strayed from Jimmy, particularly when she needed a taste and didn't have the cash. While I couldn't give a shit about him, it was tough seeing the sweet little girl I grew up with turned into a coke whore. My life was going great professionally, and along with that, I was doing great financially. So great that I decided to build a 4-bedroom home with a professional recording studio attached, so I could record small groups without leaving the comforts of my own property. Chess Piece had become a major band, and 5 years later could boast album sales in the millions. I had either written or co-written all of their hits, including 3 number-1 singles. I also wrote a string of hits for several other acts whose styles were completely different from Chess Piece. I was producing several albums a year as well. It was almost 9 p.m. when I got out of Paramount after a long production session. I had snacked on a few things at the studio during the day, but right then I needed a meal. Any kind of meal, even if it had the word happy in front of it. Okay, not quite that bad. Still, I stopped at the McDonald's closest to the studio and went inside to order. I was looking at the order board, not paying attention to much else until I looked down to order. She looked at me like she hoped the floor would swallow her up. I can't say I blamed her. Her uniform was ill-fitting and seemed to hang on her. She looked incredibly tired. To say she was pale would have been the understatement of the decade. How can I help you, Bobby? She asked. I know my mouth gaped open for a second until I regained my wits. I'll take a quarter pounder with cheese, large fries, and a large diet, I said, watching her but trying not to watch. How have you been? I asked. I'm working at a McDonald's. That's how I'm doing, Bobby. She spat at me. Oh, okay, I said. Say hello to Prince Charming for me. He left me about a year ago, she whined. I shrugged, paid for my meal, got my stuff, and left. Call me a chump. I was sitting in my favorite lazy boy eating my food when I got to feeling bad for what I had witnessed minutes before. I knew she was completely responsible for her own place in this world, but then I started to remember the good times we shared, especially when we were kids. I started to feel I at least owed it to her parents to lend a hand, especially since I could easily afford it. I knew the place closed at 11, so I had plenty of time to get back there in time. I took the new Mustang because I knew she'd probably recognize the old one. A few minutes after 11, she came out of the back door with several other employees and headed to a beat-up old Chevy POS. I followed her home at a discreet distance. She pulled into a trailer park. Yeah, I know the owners of those parks prefer the term mobile home park, but trust me, this really was a trailer park. Her unit was toward the back and was little more than a travel trailer. I sat in my car for about 5 minutes debating with myself if I should do this. Part of me hated her. Part of me probably still loved her just a little. I knocked on the door. She looked scared when she first opened the door, then shocked, then angry. She had a little Coke residue on her nose. Wow, you came here just to rub my shitty life in my face? What a great guy, she hissed. I honestly didn't know what kind of a reaction my visit would get, but I can't say I was surprised by her anger. How about shutting the fuck up and just listening for a change? I spat angrily at her. She actually looked guilty and dropped her eyes before mumbling, Okay, what? I spent the next 10 minutes laying out a plan I came up with in the last hour. That started with Kennedy spending a full month in a rehab program at a highly rated, very private facility, paid for by me. After that, she would come to work for me as an assistant. She could live with me in my house, staying in a guest room, until she felt she could afford a place of her own. The only stipulation was that she had to stay clean, in and out of my house. She would be jettisoned in a heartbeat if I felt she wasn't staying clean. So you want to be my dad and my jailer? She sneered. I know your brain is starting to go on vacation, but hear this. I don't want to be your dad, but since he's not here and you can't do it, I guess I'll have to be the one to take care of you. As for being your jailer, not going to happen. This will be on you. You get straight, you keep yourself straight. If you choose not to, that's all on you. But this way, I'll be able to live with myself, face your parents knowing I gave it a shot. You want to keep living as a coke whore, that's on you. She surprised me by starting to cry. I reluctantly wrapped her in a hug, which just made her cry harder. She still had on her McDonald's uniform, and while hugging her, I had to fight off the sickening smell of the restaurant. I also noticed that her hair was greasy, and as I held her, I started to realize that not all of the stench coming off of her could be blamed on her job. She finally stopped crying and eventually gained control of herself, even though I knew she was high. She sat in silence for a few minutes, then started nodding her head, slowly at first, then more definite. You would do that for me, after everything? After I helped him set. Yes, I figured that out. That's when I knew you were gone to me. Just one question. Were you already fucking him before you set me up? Yeah, she murmured. Fucking bass players, I snarled. 2 days later, Kennedy started rehab. I visited once per week as the rules allowed. She looked like shit the first 2 times I visited, but the light in her eyes was turned back on the last 2 times I went. We also started making plans for her moving in with me. She went into rehab and came back out with one small suitcase. That wasn't going to cut it, so the first thing we did after I picked her up on release day was hit a clothing store. I told her to buy a full wardrobe. She was hesitant at first, so I figured I'd loosen her up a bit by doing the ooh and ah thing as she came out of the dressing room with each new outfit. In truth, she had gained a couple of much-needed pounds on her frame and reminded me of the Kennedy that I had dated 100 years ago. While I will not profess to understand the female brain, I know enough to understand the importance of shoes. Most guys own a pair of black shoes, a pair of brown, and a pair of sneakers. The store had a shoe store in the back section, so once she got her clothes chosen, I grabbed her hand and led her back. She was like a kid at Christmas. I very much enjoyed running up my MasterCard, and she looked kind of guilty when I signed the receipt. "I can pay you back a little." She started before I cut her off, not unkindly. "It's okay, Ken. I'm doing all right," I said softly. If I had to put a label on it, I'd guess I'd be called rich. She looked surprised. I shrugged. I really hadn't thought about it before. I lived good, but didn't spend outrageously. I took nice vacations. My house was nice, but certainly not a mega palace. Or even a palace, for that matter. I guess my only concession to my income was the fact that I had a really cool, large Lionel train setup in my basement, professionally wired. I had Kennedy doing everything from running errands to setting up the food tables when I was producing, either at my home studio or at Paramount. I started teaching her some technical tasks as we went along. I knew she was smart and would catch on, but I was really impressed with her work ethic. She made me proud every day. At home, we existed comfortably after the first couple of weeks of awkwardness. We shared cooking duties, and she was surprised at how much better I had gotten through the years. Sometimes we even tag-teamed the meal, particularly if we were having some friends over. Parties are a fact of life in my world, but I knew they would present a problem for Kennedy, especially at first. She stayed home for the first couple of parties I attended. Then she clung to my side like a puppy for the first 2 she attended with me. She looked miserable during both parties. "What's going on, Kennedy? Just relax and have fun. I know you like to party," I said. I'm not really sure anymore how to party without Coke. It's been so long," she admitted. "I don't want to let you down, Bobby." "I don't want you to let yourself down, Ken. You've been there, done that with cocaine. You've moved past that, and if anyone pressures you to do it, they are not your friend. If anyone pressures you, you come find me. I am your friend." It was incredibly awkward the first time I went on a date. Kennedy and I had talked about this earlier, but I'm sure she felt as awkward as I did when I told her I'd be home later and left for my evening. This was one of the few times I didn't spend the night with my date, who was very understanding of the situation. We had a nice dinner and had sex afterward, but I cleaned up after we were done and drove home about 11:30. I was surprised to find Kennedy sitting in the living room reading when I walked in the door. "Hey, Ken, good book?" I said, trying to act casual. She blushed, teared up, and ran out of the room. Obviously, she was trying to act casual as well. Kennedy only went on 3 dates for the first 6 months she lived with me, and she came home early on all 3 of those. I knew from experience that she was a very sensual woman, so I wondered and worried what the story was. I was afraid, however, to ask, because things had been going so well for both of us. I was in bed just starting to drift off about a month later when I heard my room door open. I never locked the door when it was just Kennedy and me in the house. I just sort of lifted my head off the pillow, wondering what was wrong in the house when she quietly slipped into bed alongside my naked body. When she snuggled hard up against me, I could tell she was also naked. She draped an arm and a leg over my body. "Hey, inhuman." In seconds, I got hard, as a rock. She reached her hand down and took my rod into her hand, giggling as she did so. I lay there quietly for about 5 seconds, then removed her hand as I watched her smile turn into a frown. "I'm sorry, Ken. I can't do this. Physically, I want to, but emotionally, I can't. Too much water under the bridge," I said sadly. I heard her sniffle back a tear. I wasn't proud of myself at that moment, but I had been burned twice by this woman. There wouldn't be a third time, no matter how much I desired her still hot body. "I'm sorry, Bobby. This is completely on me," she said. "I ruined us. Twice. I was hoping, though." "I know, babe." Interestingly, she didn't get out of bed. She brought her hand back up to my chest. We both lay there silent for a few minutes, until I heard her breathing even out and knew she had fallen asleep. A couple of minutes later, I fell asleep too, and actually slept like a baby. I was spooned around her when I woke up the next morning. I laid there for a few minutes, then felt her stir as she woke. She quietly turned around to face me, and we lay there looking into each other's eyes for about a minute. "Thank you, Bobby," she whispered. "You're welcome, babe," I whispered back. Kennedy came into my bed the next night as well, the night after that and all the rest of the nights. We slept naked every night, but she never made another move on me, and I never made a move on her. Neither one of us went on dates anymore. I don't know about her, but I made liberal use of my right hand when she wasn't around. I still had one question left to ask, and I finally got to it one night right after we went to bed. "Why, Kennedy?" I whispered, not figuring I needed to elaborate more. I didn't. Lying in the dark, I could feel her tense. I heard her clear her throat. "You were always so safe, so secure, a nice guy, Bobby. I always figured I could go back to you, and after a while you did let me the first time," she said in a small, thin voice. "The second time I actually sort of fell in love with Jimmy, although I think I fell more in love with the cocaine. You always used to bust on me for using, but he not only didn't bust me, he used with me. And he told me that with you out of the way, I could use whenever I wanted. It sounds really stupid now, I know. With the exception of us living like monks, life was good for the next couple of years, until one week where I had 2 long production sessions within a 4-day span. Both Kennedy and I put in long hours for about a week, and while I was tired, I could tell that she was exhausted. I also noticed that she looked a little gaunt when she got into bed that night. I resolved to pay better attention. 2 weeks later, I noticed that Kennedy appeared to be having problems with her stomach. "It's nothing, hun, just a little indigestion," she said when I asked. I practically had to drag her to the doctor's office the next week when the little indigestion didn't go away. After feeling around on her stomach for a bit, the doctor set up some x-rays. X-rays led to what was supposed to be a simple biopsy for a small lump in her stomach. That led to the discovery of multiple cysts, which were determined to be malignant. The oncologist gave Kennedy a year at most, even with heavy chemo and radiation. So after a long discussion, she decided to opt out of both. She figured it was a quality of life issue. I reluctantly agreed. That night when she climbed into bed, she melted into my body and started to sob. I held her as tightly as I dared without crushing her. When she finally stopped crying, she looked up at me with nothing but love in her blue eyes. I leaned into her and crushed her lips against mine. She responded as if I was the last man on the face of the earth, with a hunger I had never felt before from any woman. Then again, I had never before been with a woman who had a death sentence hanging over her. "God, I screwed things up. Thank you, Bobby, that was wonderful," she whispered. Kennedy knew that what we enjoyed was a one-off, although we continued to sleep together in my bed up until she went into the hospital for what became her final few days. Without the chemo and radiation, her 1 year was reduced to a little more than 5 months. Kennedy's parents came to visit us soon after she was diagnosed so we could all enjoy a final good week before she was too weak. They came back once she went into the hospital, as did my parents. Several of us were always with her that final week. I was sleeping in the chair next to her bed, holding on to her left hand with my right, when I felt her give my hand a weak squeeze. I opened my eyes and saw her once bright blue eyes, now a washed-out blue, looking back at me. I leaned over and gave her a soft kiss on her lips. She gave me a tired smile and was gone. I was crying silently when the nurse, alerted by the telemetry at the nurse's station, came in to double-check her death. She was 41. God, it was tough going back home to an empty house after having Kennedy living with me for the last several years. Although I hadn't been in love with her for a long time, I loved her as a close friend, a confidant even. I had come to rely on her not only in my personal life, but also in my business life. She had become Robin to my Batman, so to speak. Her parents couldn't thank me enough for getting her cleaned up and taking care of her these last few years. I told them the truth, that I enjoyed having her in my life again. They made me promise to keep in touch. As always, music was my salvation. I had my engineering and production work, and I still continued to write when the mood struck me, which seemed to be a lot less these days. Then a germ of a song got stuck in my brain and didn't let go. It wound up being all about Kennedy in an abstract sort of way. The lyrics came easily. I struggled with the music, the tempo, the feel. I wrote mostly rock and roll, occasionally some pop. I produced music of all genres, although there were some of which I really wasn't a fan. Country and Western was one of those genres. Yet the more I played with the song, the more I realized it had to be country, even though I didn't write anything about my dog dying or my pickup being stolen, or vice versa. I reworked it twice before I found it. I was big enough in the industry that I probably could have asked anybody to sing it for me and they probably would have done so, but I walked around in a fog for a week pondering the who. Then I heard it, singing a jingle for an LA fast food restaurant. It took me 2 days to track down the name connected to that voice, Alex Logan, a relative rookie to the music scene on the West Coast. It took Alex 45 minutes to get over to my studio when I called him. He thought it was some sort of a joke when my name showed up on his caller ID. Once I convinced him it was no joke, he was out the door and in his car practically before the call ended. Message showed up on his phone, he told me later. I conceptualized the song for him and even explained the whole backstory. We worked it out together for several hours before I felt he had it right. His voice was rich and full, but he also had a gravelly rasp, giving it a raw, earthy tone. I accompanied him on the guitar only, deciding that there would be no other voices on the recording. I played back the recording 4 or 5 times. I could feel Alex watching me intently, trying to figure out what I was listening for. I had taught myself drums many years ago, sometimes needing to hear out loud the drum line I heard in my head. I overdubbed a low-key line, and several hours later I had it. I released Kathleen as a single, sending it out to a handful of country stations only. Knowing who I was, the stations started giving the song airplay. I got a call from one of the major companies who wanted to release it nationwide and distribute it. I agreed, and within a month, Alex Logan had a #1 hit and a recording deal. He gladly would have washed my car, walked my dog, or done virtually any chore I asked of him. I called John Valentine from Chess Piece and told him he and I needed to come up with 11 more country songs quickly for Alex's first album. Once I convinced him that he could write country, he was up for the challenge. Kathleen and a second song from the album both went platinum, as did the album itself. Alex was going to be a major country star for many years to come if he didn't screw things up. It wasn't unusual to hear from my agent, Ron Shapiro, on a regular basis, so I didn't think anything of the call as I answered while I was doing some post-production work on the latest Chess Piece album at Paramount a few months later. "Are you sitting down right now, Bobby?" he asked. Okay, never a good way to start a conversation. I sat down. "I am now," I answered. "You never told me you had any kids, Bobby. What the fuck?" My brain went into overdrive. When the hell did I get kids? What the fuck was he talking about? "What the fuck are you talking about, Ron? I don't have any kids. When did you start lighting up in the middle of the day?" I responded. He was silent for about 10 seconds, then he kind of coughed and cleared his throat. I knew then that he was serious. Bobby, I'm holding an ancestry.com document that says you are the DNA father of Chelsea Marie Carpenter of Chicago, Illinois, born 20 years ago." I zoned out at that point as I was trying to remember what the fuck was happening in my life 20 years ago. Oh yeah, I was jettisoning Kennedy from my life after she cheated on me with Mike Rogers. I never followed Kennedy's life after we split up. If she was pregnant at that time, I had no clue. If she was pregnant, would it have been mine, Mike's, or somebody else's? Kennedy had never told me anything of having a child, although I did know she had one with Jimmy that she gave up for adoption. Could she possibly have done this twice? If she did, though, and I was the father, wouldn't I have had to sign some kind of a waiver? A lot of questions with no answers, especially with Kennedy in her grave. I had done an ancestry DNA test and had a family tree on the site for several years. I probably hadn't checked in, though, for a couple of years. All right, I had the time and money to check this out. I decided to call this young lady and see if I could get some more information. Chelsea Carpenter sounded surprised when she answered my call. I supposed I was calling a landline and she didn't have caller ID. "Are you really the Bobby Winkler?" she asked tentatively after I properly identified myself on the phone. "I suppose so," I answered. We exchanged some basic info and pleasantries before I got right to the heart of the matter. "I'm sorry, Chelsea, if I seem somewhat reluctant to just welcome you into my life with open arms, but I knew nothing of your existence until yesterday." "How could you not know about me?" she interrupted. "Didn't you sign your rights away so I could be adopted?" "No, I never signed anything," I responded. "Honestly, your birth mother never told me she was pregnant." "But wouldn't you have had to sign something?" I always thought so, I said. How about your adoptive parents? Do they know who your parents supposedly were? Mom didn't tell me I was adopted until I turned 18, she explained. She told me my birth parents were Kennedy Stevens and someone named Mike Rogers. Then Ancestry comes back and says my dad is someone different, someone named Bobby Winkler. They didn't have Mommy Dearest in their database at all. So now I'm not really sure what to believe, but I know Ancestry's a real legit company. I set up a meeting at some lawyer's office in Chicago with Chelsea and her adoptive mother, Donna Carpenter. Her adoptive father, Cy, had died several years before, she explained. The meeting 2 days later was eye-opening for me. Chelsea's adoptive mother not only claimed, but had documentation that said her birth parents were Kennedy and Mike. She had the forms giving Chelsea up for adoption with both supposed birth parents' signatures. She claimed that the first time she heard about me was when Chelsea did her DNA test. The forms releasing Chelsea for adoption were signed by Kennedy and Mike. No DNA tests were done back then to confirm parentage. Chelsea's adoptive mother would have given Kennedy a run for her money in terms of looks. She appeared to be about my age, with decent-sized tits and a nice ass. Chelsea, her adoptive mother, and I talked for about 2 hours, just getting to know each other. Chelsea was a sophomore at the University of Illinois. Her mother worked in a pharmacy. Like a typical kid, Chelsea was incredibly impressed by who I was, or who everyone else said I was. She asked me all sorts of questions like any 20-year-old would. I invited her and her mother to my house for the upcoming spring break in a few weeks. I told them I would send them the tickets. She gave her mother the puppy dog eyes but didn't say anything. Finally, Donna gave in. Okay, spring break it is, she declared. I was about to get up and go when the question I feared most finally came up. So then, from what we can figure, was Kennedy a bit of a player? Donna asked. I looked around the room, gave a large swallow, then proceeded to explain about Kennedy and me, up until her death. She's gone? Chelsea rasped. Damn, that means I'm never going to meet her. You've also got a half-sister somewhere, too. She did the exact same thing several years later with a different guy, I said. I found out about that one. Geez, I'm not sure player comes close to describing her, Donna said. Might be better in the long run that she's gone. The kid looked unsure. I nodded at her. I'm sorry for the way things turned out, kiddo. I would have loved to have had kids, I said. But I think your parents did a great job. All I can hope for at this point is that we can be friends of a fashion. Parents are much more than just sperm and egg donors. Chelsea nodded at me with great big tears in her eyes. I walked over to her and held my arms open. She came to me and hugged me hard. I took a quick look over at Donna, who had an unreadable expression on her pretty face. I figured she was trying to gauge my reaction to her daughter. The three of us did some of the LA area tourist things the first few days, and ate at all the trendy restaurants. I had to use my status to get a table on short notice, but I didn't feel too bad about that, considering I rarely ever played that gambit. I might have been the most unrecognized celebrity in the state, and I liked that just fine. It was a beautiful late spring evening when we got back from a great dinner, and I took a bottle of red wine, 3 glasses, and one of my acoustic guitars out to my fire pit at the end of my patio in the backyard. I played the music, not the lyrics, to several of my hit songs while we sat around the fire pit and chatted. At first, the women were reluctant to converse with me, thinking I was going to sing. But as I sat there, played and talked, they kind of figured things out and we started to really get to know each other. The last few years after I got your bio mom cleaned up, we would come out here and do this same thing. Sometimes she would sing, other times we would both sing. Sometimes we would just sip wine and I'd play. This was probably her favorite place in the world those last few years. I looked up and noticed both women had tears in their eyes. It was time to lighten things up, so I played a fairly passable cover of the Eagles' Hotel California and Take It Easy. They then asked me if I took requests, and we bantered back and forth trying to come up with a song they liked that I knew how to play. We arrived at Sarah Smile by Hall & Oates, and both women started to sing while I played. Chelsea dropped out after a minute, and Donna bravely finished up solo. Wow, Mom, that was great, Chelsea enthused, leaning over and giving Donna a kiss on the cheek. I could see some of Kennedy and Chelsea. I couldn't find any of me, which was probably for the best. I could also see a lot of Donna, even though they weren't related biologically. That was nurture over nature. They shared a lot of the same mannerisms, the same giggle, the same tilt of the head. I could tell they were close as a mother and daughter. I envisioned they were a tight family when Chelsea's dad, her adoptive dad, was still alive. Thanks to Kennedy, I was an outsider and always would be. I wondered if she really thought Mike was the child's father, or was that just an easy way to sign away her baby? Then I remembered again that she actually gave 2 children away, and for about the millionth time wondered if I had ever really known who Kennedy was before I got her cleaned up. We sang, talked, and laughed a bit longer while we finished the bottle of wine. I had earlier shown them my studio and gave them a demonstration of what I did, but the next day I took them over to Paramount and gave them a full tour, introducing them to everyone as a couple of friends from Chicago. John from Chess Piece had stopped by, just on the off chance that I'd be working so we could talk face to face about what the group wanted to do for its next production. He very graciously posed for photos with the 2 women and gave Chelsea an autographed t-shirt. I took the photos with Chelsea's phone, then John grabbed the phone from my hand and insisted I get my photo taken with the pair. "A good-looking woman on each arm surely can't hurt your image, boss man," he laughed, calling me by the nickname the members of the group hung on me several years ago during the making of an album. Chelsea looked confused at the moniker, and John figured he should explain. "When he's on the other side of the glass, he thinks he's world dictator," John said. "And considering how well our albums sell, well, I guess he's right." There were several photos of the group around the studio, as well as photos of many other groups as well, several of which I had worked with and knew well. "You know all these guys. Mr. Winkler?" Chelsea said, hesitating on exactly what she should call me. I stopped moving and looked at her. Come to think of it, that was the first time she had ever addressed me as anything. I must have looked perplexed because she quickly tried to assuage any hurt feelings I might have. I'm not really sure what I should call you," she said as she and Donna exchanged puzzled looks. We looked at each other for several long seconds. "How about Bobby? It sounds much more friendly than Mr. Winkler, doesn't it?" I asked. Both women let out their breath. I knew they were both afraid I would ask her to call me Dad, which I knew she couldn't do. Her dad was dead. I was well aware of that. He was apparently a very good dad, too. I would happily take someday being a friend, maybe a good friend. "I can do that," she chirped happily. "And to answer your first question, yes, I know most of them. Some of them quite well. I've written songs for several of them, produced for several." Chelsea's face lit up. I chuckled. Donna just shook her head. Life went back to being pretty much all about work after the women went back to Chicago. I realized that in just a week, I had begun to think of them as my girls. I began to look for reasons to visit Champaign. I visited twice in a 2-month period, and Chelsea and I had 2 great weekends together. She introduced me to her friends as a friend of the family. I could take that. While I enjoyed getting to know Chelsea, I was surprised when I found myself missing her mother, Donna, as well. Aside from the fact she was a good-looking woman, she had a way about her that I found. Comforting? Sexy, right? Nope, not at all. I was clueless. I gave myself a reason to be in Chicago, and I called Donna to set up a date. A photographer friend familiar with the area recommended a restaurant called Plato's Place, and it didn't disappoint. We then went to a dance club that featured classic rock and had a blast. Donna and I attended an art show the next day, but she insisted on making me a home-cooked meal instead of going to a restaurant. When I showed up at her house, she was wearing a tight red sweater over a pair of skin-tight jeans that made me anything but comfortable. She gave me a glass of wine, and I sat and talked to her as she finished up making chicken parm. Damn, those jeans were tight, and she glided around the kitchen like she was a dancer in a previous life. At one point, she caught me checking out her ass. Hell, I was drooling. The meal was absolutely great. An ass to die for, and she could cook too. We moved into the living room after supper and talked like we were the oldest of friends. When the talking stopped, we then made love like the oldest of lovers. She was active and loud, not afraid to express herself, and she spurred me on to great heights. I brought her off 5 times with my fingers and mouth, then made her scream twice more while she rode me cowgirl. I got to play with a very solid pair of boobs while she was riding. Thank you, Bobby. That's the first time I've done that since my husband died. I might have gotten a little crazy. I'm sorry if I hurt you, she said as we cuddled afterward. Oh, please, think nothing of it, I said with a big smile on my face. I started alternating between Champaign and Chicago every other weekend. Both of those relationships were building. So, you and Mom, huh? Wouldn't that be karma? Chelsea asked. Do you think she'd give me a real shot? I asked. I really can't speak for her. She and Dad were married for 23 years. They were real lovey-dovey all the time. She was devastated when he was killed. You are the first man she's gone out with since then, Chelsea said. I took it slow with Donna. I recognized her quiet times and gave her space. We made love on most visits. She seemed to like it slow and gentle, occasionally showing a more adventurous side. I'm sorry if I'm not more demonstrative or wild or whatever, she whispered to me in bed one night after we made love. I know you music people live a wilder life than I do. I'm just a housewife living a quiet life, she said. Babe, everybody thinks all musicians are hedonistic, drug-fueled nutballs or self-centered, self-important bastards. That's only true 90% of the time. I chuckled. The rest of us are just regular people. She smiled at me and gently punched my upper arm. You know what I mean, jack off. You live in the world of the rich and famous. Hell, you are rich and famous. You'll get tired of me in a couple of months and go back to banging starlets. Wow. If I wasn't such a hedonistic jack-off, I'd be insulted right now, I said. She gave me a crooked grin. I could see the concern in her eyes. I realized she wasn't kidding. I sat up in the bed and put a pillow behind my back up against the headboard. I tapped my hip and she took the hint and put her pillow next to mine and sat with me, my arm around her body. In the interest of complete honesty, yes, I have banged a few starlets in my time, I said. I've also banged a few stars and quite a few singers. Now that I'm finished bragging, though, I'll also tell you that I've only been in love with one woman, and that woman screwed me over, twice. But that's ancient history. Also ancient history, I spent 18 months in prison in Indiana after being wrongly set up. And when I was in 5th grade in Omaha, I got sent to the principal's office for pulling a girl's hair. She raised her eyebrows when I mentioned my prison term. I knew we would have to revisit that sometime in the future. Right then, though, I took my hand from around her and reached further until I was cupping her right boob. The night was still young. Chelsea took me up on my offer to stay with me for the summer between her junior and senior years in college. I let her intern with me as my right-hand man, teaching her the job that I had Kennedy doing for me until she got sick. We spent most of every day together and were really coming into our own. I brought Donna out for her 2-week vacation, and the three of us had a great time together. Since I didn't want to overstep my bounds, I had Donna set up in her own room. She didn't bat an eye at that when I put her suitcase in her room, but Chelsea about choked to death laughing when I did that. Oh, please, do you think I'm actually believing that? She crowed. Was I born yesterday? Mom, how quietly can you sneak down the hallway at night? She giggled. Donna and I both blushed hard. It's okay, Mom. It's okay, Dad, Chelsea said. I raised my eyebrows this time. I took a sideways look at Donna to see what she thought of that last pronouncement. She was grinning. Assuming it would be okay to call you that? Chelsea added. Yeah, if you want to, I stammered. So, Rents, let's figure this out, she continued. If I get a vote, I'd say you two need to become one, so to speak, and then we can become a cute little family. I mean, it's right, isn't it? Clueless, handsome bio dad and beautiful adoptive mom get together, and smart and beautiful daughter makes 3. Practically a movie of the week. Yeah, but where are we going to find someone to play the part of the daughter? I asked, trying to sound innocent. 2 words, neither of which is happy birthday, old man, she sassed back. I'm pretty sure she gets that from your side of the family, Donna said. Whack slam, I cried. Did someone get the license plate of the bus that just ran me over? Both women laughed. I've got to admit, when the kid was right, she was right. I popped the question to Donna on the last night of her vacation with us. I had actually bought the ring the week before Donna visited. Both women cried. Donna grabbed me to her and sobbed uncontrollably, soaking the shoulder of my shirt. Although she never actually said the word, I took that as a yes.